All right. Hey there, folks. Since book tour and conventions are still somewhat on hold, I figured I'd bring book tour to you. So, welcome to Russ's Rockin' Rollercoaster Season 4, intriguing interviews with creative minds. With us tonight is my friend BRUCE COFFIN, the award-winning author of the Detective Byron mysteries, a former detective sergeant. BRUCE supervised all homicide and violent crime investigations for Maine's largest city. Following the terror attacks of September 11th, 2001, BRUCE spent 4 years investigating counterterrorism cases for the FBI, earning the Director's Award, the highest award a non-agent can receive. In addition, his short fiction has appeared in a number of anthologies, including Best American Mystery Stories of 2016. Welcome back, BRUCE.
Thank you very much.
All
Happy
right.
anniversary, by the way. Russ.
Thank you. Tonight is also, as BRUCE said, tonight is also a bit of a milestone for me over here at the Rollercoaster, as our segment marks my official 1-year anniversary hosting the show. So go me.
Very cool.
But really thanks to all of you, because if it wasn't for you guys watching, there'd be no show to have. All right. So heads up to the folks at home. Feel free to send me notes or questions you have for me or BRUCE in the chat box during the show, and we'll get to a few at the end. All right, BRUCE, as we always do, let's start at the beginning. So where were you born and where'd you grow up?
I was born in, growing up is still a process that I'm endeavoring to work on, but I was born in Portland, Maine, right where I ended up working as a police officer for almost 3 decades.
Wow. So when you were a kid, so what was it like growing up there?
My folks moved me out when I was fairly young to a nearby town, like a suburb town of Greater Portland area of Scarborough, the town of Scarborough. And it's funny because was a very small town when I went there. Matter of fact, it was so small that when we ran track and field my first 2 years of high school, we didn't have a track. Okay. So if we had to meet, we had to use somebody's school track that was, they were away at another meet and we would use their track. So it wasn't until the last 2 years that suddenly we were on our way to becoming Sweet Valley High, and there was a lot of money being spent. So, but and so when I finally left Scarborough and went to work for the police department in Portland, even though I had spent some time there when I was a kid, I had to learn Portland all over again. Wow, it was like I knew where the main streets were, I knew where to go to get an Italian sandwich, and I knew where the cathedral was. But other than that, I kind of had to learn it all over again. So
that must have been a little trippy, right?
It was a little trippy. Like in Portland has really, like a lot of cities, Portland has 2 parts to it. There's, suburbia, which is where pretty much all the 1- and 2-story businesses are in the homes, and then the technically high rises of the in-town peninsula. So there's really a lot to learn, and you wouldn't think there would be any more room to put in streets, and yet every time you turn around, there's something new going up or being torn down. So a lot of change,
So when you were growing up, was it just you? You have brothers, sisters?
I have 2 siblings, but my brother was 5 years younger than I, and he was born just before we moved to Scarborough. And my sister didn't come along until I was 12, so she never knew Portland. She'd only known Scarborough. So,
all right. So what was that? So I mean, I've got a couple of sisters. They're younger than me. They're twins, but 4 years difference. But you have 5 and 12 years difference. So, what was that like? What was your relationship with your siblings?
It was weird. I think. Well, my brothers, I think was fairly common, fairly normal. I was probably a horrible older brother to him. That's just part of my job, I guess, right?
Yeah, right.
And
look, it's in the contract.
Yeah, absolutely. I probably still should apologize to him for all the stuff I've done, but my sister was really strange. I kind of, just because there was such a difference, and when she finally started to become, where the personality was really coming out of her, at that point I left. I went off to have my own life. And so I've kind of always felt like an uncle to her.
Right.
Now in later years, she has her own children and stuff. And I think it's I feel like she's more like my younger sibling, but it took a long time for me not to feel like the uncle,
Right. So was it a thing where, I mean, I could get it. I mean, so if she's born when you're 12, even when she's 3 and, kind of scampering around, you're already 15, 16 years old, like, I'm out of here.
Yeah,
I'm hanging with friends. I don't want to be around.
Well, it's true, right? Even your parents aren't cool to hang around when you're in your teens, late teens, like that, right?
What about you and your brother? Would you guys was it the kind of thing where I mean, you guys were probably, I'm assuming, never in the same school because you were probably like one
Right.
level up.
Right. Yeah. I mean, until a certain age, I think we did a lot together. We spent a lot of time together. And our friends sort of overlapped age wise. Like they were sort of always in between. So there were plenty of people to hang around with, even if it wasn't necessarily cool to hang around with your older brother. And it wasn't, I think, until I got into high school that the distance really started to develop. And then, of course, after I graduated and went to college, he was just entering high school at that point. So the gap really seemed to grow.
Yeah. So as a kid, so what was your thing? What kept you busy back then?
I wrote a lot of stories. I wrote a lot of short stories when I was younger.
So
Yeah, that was one of my things.
right.
I started writing short stories very early on, and I did that all through high school and college, and with an eye toward becoming. I tell people I wanted to be the next Stephen King. I think that was my goal back then. So
Wait, so that's interesting. So he's obviously a Maine guy. Like how
right.
geographically, what's the distance between where kind of you were and where he was?
Well, he actually was. Actually, at the time, I think he wasn't in Bangor. He hadn't bought that house with the cool fence around it yet. He was doing. What was he doing? I'm trying to think at that point. It was a town outside of that anyway, but maybe an hour and a half north.
Okay. Did you ever get a chance to like see him at a signing? Or?
Oh yeah, no. I went to every time there was a book signing. I went to places that the bookstores are not even around anymore. Bookland was one of the places we went. I can't. There was a place in the mall, the main mall, and I can't tell you what the name of the store was, but it was one of the big ones back in the day. And we used to stand there online, and we'd take every Stephen King book we had and get them signed up. So he was very approachable, even as big as he was, because he sort of everything was really Maine based at that point. So
right. So were you
always a thrill?
So when you were a kid, so when you were writing, were you? So I mean, at the time when Stephen King first got started, he was really. I mean, he's morphed over the years, but he was really a horror guy to start.
Right.
Was that your thing? Was it that you were into Stephen King, or you were into horror, or both?
Well, I think he dragged me into horror more. I mean, I always love getting scared reading a book or scaring yourself with a movie, especially if it's late at night and there's no one around and you're watching it in a house by yourself. Okay. That's really terrible. When you're walking up the stairs and shutting lights off and looking over your shoulder, to me that always did something for me. But his storytelling, I think, really was the thing that was the draw for me, regardless of the genre. His ability to spin that yarn and keep you engaged was something I really focused on.
So actually, speaking of which, it's interesting. So I haven't read a lot of King, although I've read some. Like The Stand still is one of my favorite books of all time.
Yeah, great book.
And some of his short stories, the one that had the body and Shawshank Redemption, right?
Yes,
great stuff in there. But at the time, if my memory serves, initially he was kind of perceived, oh, he's such a hack, he's not a real writer, and he's just garbage. And then at some point things turned, and then he became like a superstar, and then all of a sudden everyone loved him. He was the great, what a great writer, and he's so vivid. And now I'm finding, as I'm seeing, I mean, granted, people online have all sorts of opinions about anything, but I'm seeing a recent sort of a resurgence of the King backlash, how he's such a crappy writer, and he's not, this is not an example of the kind of writing that you should follow. I mean, so what's your take on that kind of thing?
I think that's not a new thing. I think everything that we see now, because social media is such a big deal and it's such an instantaneous deal, and people that would never have had a pulpit to preach from or to try to bully anyone from have one. But I think that's always gone on. I mean, Dickens used to get lambasted on a regular basis for his writing. Norman Rockwell, one of the most endearing figures in Americana art, was considered a hack and just an illustrator and this and that by people of his time. I think that's always the way it has been. I think the true genius sometimes of a lot of creative people really don't end up being recognized until later on.
Yeah,
and I think a lot of times when you hear this stuff, I think it might just be envy and not realistic.
It's funny. I think about that sometimes, because I've for some reason it just popped up on a couple of Facebook chats or whatever groups. I just happened to see it, and there was all this sort of Stephen King bashing, and I'm thinking, you know what? When you have a career that's 1/100th
Right.
of what
Right.
it is. You know,
Right.
you know what? If my career ever gets to be that, I'll be happy to sell out all day.
Right.
Great, great. Yeah, you could sell me out as a multi-gazillionaire. Sure.
Right.
Right. You know.
I really caution people about ever doing that kind of thing anyway, because the reality is, if you know this business and you know how hard it is to write a novel, a good novel, and to continue doing that all the time, I think.
And sell.
Yeah, exactly. And you know what the problem is I think the longer you have been around as he has,
Yeah.
people come to expect a certain level.
Yep.
And I don't know if it's possible to even think about being able to write a great book every single time out. I don't know if that's possible, because you run the risk of becoming formulaic.
Yeah.
It's almost better that you continue to try and broaden your horizons and write different things if you can do it.
I mean, depending on how you judge these things, I mean, how many authors can say I've written even one great book?
Right.
I mean,
It's
I don't
true.
know. I don't know how you however you define great, but doing it once is pretty tough. Doing
Yeah.
it multiple times, I mean, it's
It is true.
not that common, you know.
No, it is true, and every writer struggles with that. I think you know
Yeah.
we're all chasing. Hopefully, all of them are chasing that next best book, and
Yeah.
that I don't think that is related to sales. That's about doing something that is at the highest level you can do.
Yeah. I mean, what else? Because you can never really, no one can know for sure what's going to sell. So
No,
you do the
no,
best you can with what you know at the time that you do it. Right.
yep, and hopefully enjoy the process.
Yeah.
You know, it's a long ride, and
Oh,
hopefully
sure.
you enjoy what you're doing. You know,
Sure is. So so one last question on this. So,
yeah.
so you like to be, at the time, you like to be scared, you like to score. Like, what was some of your, like, give me a handful of like your top, you know, this was the, you know, when I'm home alone and my parents told me I'm not supposed to, or I should be sleeping, and you're
Right.
sitting down. What were you reading or what were you watching?
Geez, I mean, I watched all the old black and white horror movies,
Yeah.
you know, like I think everyone did, and I can't remember now what they were called.
Right.
I don't know if it was Imperial or who it was that was cranking those out. It was, but anyway, there was like the Wolfman and the vampire movies, all that stuff. I love that stuff.
So
growing up as a kid,
kind of like
Frankenstein.
the classic
Yeah.
monsters, right?
Yep.
All right.
And books. I mean, Stephen King, Salem's Lot, The Shining. The original Shining, still gets me. I just think that's such a great story. And in spite of the fact that Kubrick did a really great horror movie from that,
Right.
the fact that it is so different from the book bothered me a little bit, because I saw the book more like I think Stephen King meant it to be seen.
Right.
There was the relationship between the son and the father was such a big component in that.
Right.
And it was sort of overshadowed by the haunted hotel thing, you know.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
I still think that's a great book to pick up and read. I really love the original novel.
I'm such a scaredy cat. I can't do it. I just can't do it. I admit it. I don't like to be scared. It's not my jam. But right on. All right. So if I did my homework properly, you studied, and this is it, and this has really caught my eye. You studied accident reconstruction in college.
Yep.
I mean, I saw that, and I really, you know, my ears were buzzing. So tell me about that. What goes into that?
Oh, it's a lot. It's funny. Remember, we all used to tell ourselves that when they were trying to teach us algebra and geometry and all those things, we would never use those. You know, we just had to worry about our checkbook and when the next check was coming in from whatever job we took. And I remember saying that very thing. And there I was going right through it again. It was all algebra. It was all geometry. It was conservation of linear momentum and physics. All those things that we all worked hard to get by in school, suddenly I was doing them and had a purpose, which was actually very cool. So, and really, I think being an accident reconstructionist was the thing that led me to want to be the homicide detective, because.
Well, hang, but I want to hear about that, but go back.
Yeah.
So your accident reconstruction. So give me one example. Walk me through what you would have actually done on site.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, I mean, we went in and we were only used for fatal or technically could be a fatal accident. And so they would bring us in and you would treat it exactly like a crime, like a murder scene.
Who brought you in?
The patrol unit would, the patrol commander would call us in to respond. And because really what you were doing, you were coming in to reconstruct what had happened in the in the likelihood that there might be charges like a manslaughter charge that would result from that. A lot of times when a fatal accident would happen, it would be because of an OUI or a DWI, depending on where you are in the country. And so we treated it exactly the way you would treat a homicide scene. You know, you had to lock your witnesses down. Physical evidence at the scene had to be recorded and captured and measured, everything. I mean, we measured things like you would watch somebody go out and try to figure out, you know, using all the tools that they use, the property boundaries and this kind of thing. We would do that with every single piece of evidence, everything that came off the vehicles. Vehicle autopsies would be done as part of what we did. So we would tow vehicles to a place where we had a mechanic would actually tear the vehicle down and tell us what mechanically was wrong with it that might have contributed to the accident. We'd be able to go back and reconstruct speeds. You know, you're looking at everything, viewpoints, you know,
So go back to that. So you're saying like constructing speeds. So
right.
How exactly does that happen?
It's actually, well, I shouldn't say simple, but in theory, it's more simple than you would imagine because everything is about braking. It's about, you know, skid marks left on the road, or in the case of anti-lock brakes, you might just be able to see that kind of stuff. Conservation of linear momentum was the higher end of that, and it was where that would be used is, let's say you were in a fatal accident and I see the skid marks that your vehicle has left prior to impact. I can see where they start.
Right.
I know where the impact happens. And then let's say both vehicles are absolutely demolished, they're totaled.
Right.
From what's left of those vehicles, we actually are able to extrapolate out the speed at that point. So the speed of impact that it would take to create that much damage with those vehicles. So now I have the actual impact speed or a minimum impact speed. And then from all those other things you've left, like the skid marks on the road, I can now go back and try to figure out what your minimum speed was as you started braking. And then from that, I can go back and find out at what point you should have reacted to what was coming. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's just, it's really like putting a mystery together. I mean, you're looking at all the evidence and you're figuring out where things happened, at what point during that whole process things happened.
So were you, I mean, again, my experience in this is just what I see, what I watch in TVs and movies and whatnot.
Right.
You doing the, the strings and the trajectory lines? Is that part?
Oh yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Everything. Yeah. I mean, it's crazy. And we would take, our measurements would be so exact, which is really the same thing you do at a crime scene, a murder scene.
Right.
That we were able to go back and do scale drawings or even reconstruct it and put it back together so that a jury could see what actually happened, what we saw.
So when you studied this in college, so let me just understand this.
No, I learned all that afterwards. That was all within the police department.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, I had the basics. I had already had algebra 1, 2, geometry, all that kind of stuff, physics.
Got it. So this is when you were a member of the police force. Then
yes.
You went. Now at that point, were you a detective then or not yet?
No, it was considered a traffic investigator and part of the fatal team. So like I say, really all we did with the death scenes, the traffic death scenes. Right. So you really were the traffic equivalent of a homicide investigator because you had to deal with the autopsy of the body. You had to deal with notification of next of kin. You had to deal with all the evidence and those things that were presented. And at the end of the day, you had to put this entire package together and be able to take it in front of a judge, and a jury, and possibly try somebody with a vehicular manslaughter. So it was really a great training ground for me to get to the point where I would be involved in homicides.
Right. So let me ask, about how many, roughly of those kind of reconstructions did you do, you think?
Oh, well, I can tell you 1 year, I think we investigated 12 fatal accidents. So, and I did that I think I was on that team for 4.5 years, maybe.
So give or take, you did about 40 or 50 of these over.
Probably. Yeah. And not all of them ended up being fatal. Obviously we were brought in anyway, but it was quite a bit of work.
So let me ask you, so having done enough where you can say, all right, I kind of get what happens here. What's something that really, whether it was on one specific case or that happened consistently, that really kind of surprised you?
I don't know if surprise is the word I would use, but how many how many times people would put themselves in that situation. I think it's just the head shaker. You know, a lot of strange things. We used to have a lot of fatal accidents would happen on a road called Baxter Boulevard, which is really, it's just sort of serpentines around the outside of the Back Cove in Portland. And it has all these old trees, you know, like say every 150 feet, there might be this tree that's 100 years old or whatever. And it's amazing how much those became car magnets. Right. You'd think that cars would just go into the water and that would be the end of it. But it was like every time you turn around, a car would slam into one of those trees. It was just nuts. But yeah, over and over again.
Why do you think that was?
I think it's one of those things where if you're trying to avoid something, you're staring at it, and that's where you end up going.
Right. Like, you know, I shouldn't do this. I shouldn't do this. I shouldn't do this.
Right. The NASCAR drivers say, if you're trying not to hit something, don't look at it.
Right.
Look where you want to go, not where you're going. You know.
Right. Fair enough. All right, so let me ask. So you're on the police force. Was it always your goal to become a detective, or did that kind of unfold organically?
Actually, for me, it started fairly early on because there was a gentleman by the name of Mike Wallace who was the detective sergeant in charge of the homicide unit when I was still within my first, I don't know, maybe 8 years or so on the job, and I interacted with him frequently. And Mike was just that guy that he always would take time out to stop and show you how to do something or to correct you if you were doing something wrong, and to give you a little nugget of something that might you could take with you and use later. And I looked up to him. I think everyone looked up to him. And he was one of those guys where you said, you know what, if I could do any job in this building, that's the job I want. And I think early on, because of my interactions with him, I just began to focus that way. I always enjoyed investigations, but the natural progression is you want to investigate something that's considered more important as time goes on.
So ultimately, when you became a detective, you did that, for approximately 15, 20 years, something like that?
As an investigator, I think I did over half my career as an investigator, and almost half of my career as a detective sergeant. So, and when I got that role, which is what I wanted, I wasn't going to give it up. I turned down lieutenant in order to get that job. So
what is detective sergeant exactly? What does that mean?
That's the direct supervisor for all the detectives who are working the cases. And in our department at that time, the detective bureau was basically split into three parts. The smallest unit was the drug unit. And generally, they were also on loan to the main Drug Enforcement Administration. So although they were Portland detectives and or detective sergeant, they were on loan to a state agency. And then the other two in-house versions were the detective unit that investigated all the property crimes, burglaries, thefts, auto break-ins, auto thefts, that kind of stuff. And then there were the crimes against person unit, the violent crime unit. And that was everything from domestic assault, sexual assault, bank robberies, homicides, everything in between you can think of. Right. And so each one of those units had a supervisor, a detective sergeant that oversaw every investigation.
So at that point, were you, just sort of, back at the, at the precinct, sort of, kind of quarterbacking things, or were you actually out in the field with your team at that point?
Really both. I mean, it would depend on the case. I mean, some of the stuff they really didn't need me around for, and we all know, having come up through probably any job, we all know what it's like to have the boss sniffing over your shoulder.
Sure.
I knew when I was needed and when I wasn't. We even in the property, the crimes against persons side, I had a range of experience of the detectives that worked for me. And so you knew which detectives, depending on the seriousness of the case, might need more than just you being there on a phone. So it really depended. If it was a homicide, it was pretty much all hands on deck.
Right.
Because there was plenty of work initially for everybody to get involved until we got a handle on things. So
Right. So let me ask you, so going back to your accident reconstruction, so you've got this really, very specific, very detailed experience under your belt. Mm-hmm. By the time you were, supervising a squad, and how many people were under your charge at that point? About
there were 8 detectives and then 4 evidence technicians.
So that accident reconstruction experience, how were you able to sort of translate what you had done hands-on to your team to help guide them in their investigations?
Well, I think it's the same exact skill set. I mean, everything's attention to detail, making sure that your investigation goes in order, making sure that you've locked down witnesses and not let people, leave the scene that actually would be paramount later on to what you need to know, because it's the same exact thing. Every investigation has those multiple sides. On TV, depending on the TV show that you're watching,
Right.
some of them focus entirely on the tech.
Right.
They love the tech. They love the computer thing. They love,
CSI.
whatever DNA. Right. But in reality, human interaction, which is the same stuff I think that we like to write about and read about, is where a lot of these cases get made, because it's what people see, it's what they perceive, it's the fear, what motivates the bad guy.
Right.
All those things matter, and they're not necessarily quantifiable things that you can go and measure with some device.
So that's my next question, actually. So, you start off saying, look, there's X crime or potential crime. We're brought in, we investigate, and we do the best job at the time that we think we can do, and we collect evidence.
Right.
How much I'm talking real world, not TV, real world, doing your job, and the evidence sort of paints whatever picture it paints. Maybe it's clear, maybe it's a little less clear. How much of it is, well, the evidence says X, but my gut tells me something else? How often does that happen where they're in conflict?
Well, I think it happens quite often, but I think that's the constant fight, where you'll find a lot of times. I mean, because actually it's funny, the book I'm currently working on has to do with a previously adjudicated homicide, and there's an Innocence Project connection in this whole thing. So I'm delving into that fairly heavily on the 5th novel that I'm writing. But it's one of the things I think where people get into trouble is that you start assuming everything, or you're working to try and get what you're finding to fit your theory. Right. And that's the last thing you should be doing. I mean, that's after you've collected and analyzed and gone back to witnesses more than once. That's the point at which things should become a little bit less misty to you.
Right.
But to do that early on, you'll start discounting things that don't go along with your theory, sure. And now you're looking the wrong way. Real easy to get lost in that kind of a shuffle. So I think everything has to be, that's the toughest part. I mean, you have to keep an open mind. A lot of times things will look a certain way, and then it's only because you only have so much information.
Right.
I tell people it's like watching a sporting event live. How many times have you yelled at the television screen or the umpire or whatever, right? Because the guy was safe at first base, right?
Thousands.
And then you see different angles and slow it down, and it's obvious the guy was not safe at all. He was out by a mile.
Yeah.
But you're convinced.
Right.
Well, in a murder case, there's a lot of crazy stuff happening, and by the time most people are aware of what is going on, there's a lot that's happened that they've already missed.
Right.
And so, depending on the point at which, if you're a witness, let's say you and I are both witnesses to something,
right,
and you pick up on it before I do, and then I'm 5 seconds behind you when I finally am able to get a visual on what's happening. Your perception of what happened is going to be entirely different than mine, right, because you have 5 extra seconds that you've seen.
Right.
And yet both of ours will be different than somebody who's actually involved in it, because they've been a part of the whole thing. So that's how this stuff happens. And this is why you want to make sure you have multiple statements and points of view. Right. And, there's a lot more to it than you think,
Right. There's gaps and inconsistencies.
Yep.
Let me ask you, were you ever in a case involved personally where early on, your gut told you whatever it said, and you overlooked something and you went back and you went, damn it, I really shouldn't have done that, and I wasted time, or I went down the wrong path? Or did that happen a lot, or no? Or
every once in a while it would. You get really good at and used to reading people,
right,
because a lot of people that you run into in that job have the same motivations, have the same things right or wrong with them. You get used to seeing stuff like that. And sometimes they talk about unreliable witnesses.
Right.
Sometimes we had unreliable victims.
Right.
And they would come in and you might be either convinced that what they're saying is dead on and you take it at face value.
Right.
And then it's not until you start diving into this thing and talking to other people and pulling video that you realize that either they're intentionally embellishing,
or they were so shaped
or lying to you, or they're just out to lunch and they've got a totally wrong perspective on this whole thing. Right. You know, you get to a point sometimes where you're like, okay, I can't buy anything this person's telling me.
Right.
And then other times they come in and they say all the wrong things, and it looks like they're there seeking attention.
Right.
When in fact they really were victims.
Right.
So it's really hard. It's hard to read, and that's why I say it's really bad to jump to conclusions. You need to kind of run things through.
Yeah. All right. One last question on this, and we're going to move on. So one of the big things you see in crime fiction of all kinds, and particularly I think on television more than movies, is that so the cops come in, they're investigating whatever crime. It seems like almost, I wouldn't say all, but most of the, whether it's a victim or a witness, they're so confident with the way they deal with the cops. I'm not talking to you. I don't know. Screw you. Bite me. I'm not talking to you. I don't know. It seems like most people, like when they're confronted by the police, even if like someone, the siren goes off, it goes off because you blew a red light or whatever, you get nervous. It doesn't. How realistic is that really? Where people you're investigating are really that combative or so confident that they're just not going to talk to you?
Well, actually, you'd be surprised how frequently that does happen.
Really? Okay.
It's really a question of why, what their motivation is. Sometimes it's only because some of the people you're dealing with have been involved in the system so many times. They've just become, they're jaded. They know the game.
Right.
It's almost like it's their job. It's incumbent upon them to give the police a hard time.
Right.
Or their attorney told them they need to give the police a hard, some people just have to do it. Right. Sometimes it's bravado because their friends are right there.
Right.
They want to look like a bad dude, but other times it's just because they're afraid. Right. Some people get really combative just because they're terrified of having to deal with the police.
Right. Their anxiety comes in. Starts pumping.
Yeah. And you also have no idea what it is. Sometimes we dealt with people that we were investigating. If you're investigating the homicide, there's really nothing else I care about but solving this homicide.
Right.
But you running into people who have been involved in a number of different things that are illegal. Right. And they're trying to protect themselves from the discovery of that. And they know it's inevitable that it will be discovered because we're working this case.
Right.
But they don't realize that we really could care about that. I mean, it's amazing what you don't care about when you're trying to solve a murder.
Right.
But people will get real defensive because they're trying to hide the other things they're up to.
Right. Because they don't know that you don't care that they stole a car.
Even if I say I don't, they're not going to necessarily believe me, so.
Right. Yeah.
But there's a lot of that.
Right. Okay. I know. We know you stole the car, but we don't care about that. And he's like,
right.
Yeah, right. You don't care. Yeah, right. Okay. So look. So let's transition. So you started writing when you were young. Tell me when you first got serious about it.
Well, I tell people I was actually paid to write short stories when I was in high school by some of my friends that they promptly attached their names to and turned in. So that's when I learned how lucrative it could be. Not a real high ethical standard, I think, at that point, but I wait for the day that the anthology comes out and somebody else's name of short stories that I wrote. But I think I was really serious about it really early on. I tell people it almost sounds like a cliche, but for me, reading that Salem's Lot was the first Stephen King book I read. And I felt like, I've read a lot of different things at that point, stuff that we were required to read in school and things I picked up because I wanted to read them. I read the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew and all that kind of stuff, and Jack London and a lot of different things. But for me, that Stephen King thing that was over the top, the vampire story, I learned a lot about what I liked about storytelling, and that he was able to take what was really a far-fetched concept, but because he wrote about real places,
right, and
described people that felt like people I knew that I would see every day in Maine, it made that story so much more realistic and made it come to life. Yeah. He really did. And to me, that was a trick I picked up on immediately reading that. I'm thinking, this is why this worked. This is why this story that really is one of those, how do you keep a straight face things? It's the time-worn vampire story, but he brought it to present day and he inserted it in a place I feel like I knew, and here's the coffin coming in and being delivered in the middle of the night to CBL, to the Casco Bay Line's ferry terminal building, and a couple of guys get hired to bring it to the town, and it's just a big box. They don't know what it is, and it just made it so realistic. To me, that was like a step up from storytelling that I had been getting to that point.
Right. So let me ask you. So, I mean, one of the things going back to Stephen King, of the Stephen King that I've read, is that, plot aside, the characters always felt so real. Like
right.
they were vivid, and they weren't caricatures, and they weren't cliches. They were just these people they were just regular people in life who got caught up in some crazy stuff. So let me ask you this. In your writing, are you more interested in telling a great mystery or focusing on character?
It's sort of a 50-50 for me. It's a sort of a 50-50. And I think the only reason that I learned that early on, that lesson, was because between the books I read that are series, I'll give an example. One of my favorites is the Dave Robichaux books by James Lee Burke. Between books that are series and between television shows where we watch a lot of the British crime series and that kind of thing. And we found that, like I say, my wife and I, one of our favorites is really probably considered a cozy, I think.
Right.
Although not every episode is cozy, but Midsomer Murders has been going on for like 23 seasons.
Yep.
And the writing isn't always the greatest. They've come a long way from the original books, the books that they were using to try and draw that series from. But the characters really stuck with me. And I wanted to see, even if the plot was bad for a particular episode, what those characters were up to next.
Yeah.
And I still feel that way. So when I began writing the Byron series, I knew when I wrote that first book that I wanted to create a character who would develop, that I'm bringing you somebody who's already damaged goods.
So for those of us who haven't,
right,
tell us a little bit about this character, since he's sort of like your staple here.
So John Byron is a second generation Portland police officer. His dad, Reese, was a cop before him. So that was one of the things I wanted to do, was insert in my main character that childhood trauma of growing up with a cop as a dad, and then he works where you live. So you can think of the horror of knowing that all your friends know your dad's a cop, right?
Is that true for you? Was your dad a cop?
No, he wasn't. My uncle was. I just took that to another extreme. But I thought, how hard would that be, as a kid, to be in that situation? And so John grew up on Munjoy Hill in Portland. He was raised Irish Catholic. His mother was very religious. His father was not. And basically John ends up following in his dad's footsteps, in spite of all the things he said he wouldn't do, including that. He ended up doing it anyway.
Right.
And when you find John, one of the reasons he's damaged, in addition to his marriage failing and the job being stressful because it is what it is, we also find out that John suffered the childhood trauma of losing his dad when John was only a teenager, and in fact finding him dead.
Oh,
and so,
right.
but then there's a whole thing about what John thinks he knows versus what really happened. And so the first book really is a discovery and a historical look at who my character is and why he is who he is.
Right.
And I felt like that was the best way to bring a group of readers into a new series.
Great.
So yeah, that's pretty much how I looked at it. I wanted to create that character arc that I love in the series that I read.
Great. So let me ask you, so within your mysteries, some of what you write is gruesome.
Yes.
So in what ways did your time in law enforcement influence how you write about crime?
Well, you say gruesome, and there are some things, I guess. I try to write around those. I feel like most readers of murder mystery are fairly learned, and they get it. They know it. We've all watched the autopsies on the TV shows to the point where you've been to one almost. So I feel like there's less that people know about it. Not so much anymore. People really are fairly grounded in the vernacular and all that stuff. So I can sort of play around the edges of stuff and insinuate things and give you enough that you can paint the picture yourself. I try to write it in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Where I get into more detail is I add as much as I can the human element of it. I want the reader to feel the stress that goes along with trying to work a case like this. I want the reader to realize what's at stake and to feel the anguish of the surviving relatives, to have to push back against the higher ups and the politicians that try to insert themselves into your case.
Right.
I want that frustration to be felt by the reader.
Actually, I'm glad you actually hit on my next question.
Okay.
So a common trope in crime fiction of all types is that bureaucracy gets in the way of doing your best work. Is that something that you experienced in law enforcement? And how much, for those of us who also write crime fiction, do you believe the interference from above, how much of that makes a good story? How much does it add to the tension?
Well, I think it adds a lot to a story. And I think there's a reason that it has become a trope. I mean, it may have been a trope because it made for good television or good mystery novels, but it's a real thing. And it's real because the stakes don't get any higher than when you're investigating a murder. And how many times have you heard someone say, "Oh my God, I know so-and-so, they would never be capable of killing somebody."
Right.
We've all said that, but the reality is I've seen, I grew up, and it was funny, my sister and I used to have this conversation all the time, and I would talk about things that would happen at work. And her opinion when she was younger was that I was jaded about my opinion of human nature because I only saw bad people. And that was where the argument came from. And I still even tell people to this day, no, what you're missing is I don't just deal with bad people. I deal with everybody, but I see them at their worst.
Right.
So they've just been victimized. They've just done something. They've victimized somebody else, whatever it is. And so you see everybody at their absolute worst. And for me, that's one of those things that adds a lot to it. You realize that the stakes are very high. People will try to insert themselves into the case because, it might be for career purposes. It might be because they believe little Johnny really isn't capable of this, and they're willing to do anything to try and derail your case because it looks like you're looking at little Johnny. All those things happen in real life too. And so if it's somebody who's influential, let's say it might be somebody very powerful in the community who's a suspect in a murder case, you can imagine how crazy that gets. And the attorneys coming out of the woodwork. And
did that ever happen?
Every case, depending on what was going on, could become a.
I mean, were you ever part of an investigation where somebody powerful was kind of right, either as the victim or a suspect? Did that ever happen to you?
That did what now?
So
just that they were influential, you mean?
So, right. So they were powerful within the community and they were either the victim of a crime or they were a suspect in a crime.
Yes. Oh yeah. No, more than once. That stuff happens all the time.
Wow.
And there's just so many different dynamics that you can't imagine. Those are things you think you wouldn't even have to care about, that they wouldn't matter, because it's a murder, right? It should supersede everything.
Yeah.
But it doesn't, it just doesn't. The game is already afoot.
Right.
Before the murder happens. And so people don't just suddenly give up their power or their influence and not insert themselves into cases if they can do it. So
it's the opposite. The more
you
have to lose, the more you're going to want to protect it.
Right. I mean, you see it every day. I mean, how many times have you seen the attorney try the case in the public media?
Right.
Right. I mean, I always thought that was the joke for us, is if you had to try it in front of the television cameras, you didn't have a very good case.
No, you're in trouble. Right?
You would save that for court.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's how it worked,
Right. All right. So just a quick interlude for the folks who came in a little late. If you have any questions or comments for Bruce and myself, send them in the chat box and we'll get to a few at the end of the show. All right, Bruce. So here's what we're going to do. You got a new book coming out. I'm going to share my screen and I want you to show some folks what we got. All right. So hang on one second.
All right.
Tell me. All right. Can you see this?
Yep. Got it.
All right. So what do you got? Tell us about what you got here.
So it's funny because now that the world is beginning to open back up, I feel like I'm finally getting a chance to launch this book out. Within Plain Sight actually was released last February, and it just won the Maine Literary Award for Best Crime Fiction Novel.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Very excited about that. But yeah, we're finally starting to do things again. So I feel like I'm finally getting a chance to launch this book properly. And I'm very happy with this. This book, we had just made reference to the character arc. When I wrote the first three, I was under the contract for the three books, and this one obviously required its own contract. So the series has already gone on longer than we originally had planned.
Right.
And for me, I knew where I wanted the third book to end, which was Beyond the Truth, and I ended it exactly that way. And so I feel like I love the departure too in the cover here. They finally did away with the silhouette theme, and it almost has a new beginning feel.
Yeah.
Because for me, this is the next chapter in John's life. And I think everyone who's been following along wants to see how he'll succeed, or will he succeed?
So what's the basic mystery in this one?
In this one, what ends up happening early on, the first scene actually is a secondary character named Wynn, and it's Irwin Glantz, who is a informant and a friend of John Byron's. He is a homeless street guy with a substance problem. He is a military war vet, and John ended up befriending him one night years before when he was about to commit a burglary in the middle of the night. And John got there in time before it actually happened. Bought him a meal, struck up a conversation with him, and then they've been buds ever since, where he knows he can go to him. Right. And there's an interesting parallel in that John's battling his own substance demons. So I think he sees in Wynn what his life could be like if he doesn't, keep a handle on things.
Right.
So anyway, Wynn wakes up, in the midst of he's not sure if he's hallucinating or because he's drunk or whatever, but he's been sleeping in a dumpster to get out of the elements. And somebody tosses a bag into a dumpster while he's there, and then drives away. And he makes a gruesome discovery. Right. And that's how we open the book.
All right.
And then in the next scene, John is called hours later to an abandoned lumberyard on Portland's waterfront. And they find the abandoned corpse of a headless young woman.
Oh boy!
And that's how this book opens.
All right! Wow. So this is the fourth book in this series, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
And you're working on the fifth one now, right?
I am. Yes. Yeah. Tentatively titled Under the Gun.
Okay. Great. All right. That's some cool stuff. All right. So, as we do in every show, now it's time to spin the wheel. All right. On the wheel are 7 possible categories. Wherever it lands is what you get, and the categories are: Silence of the Lambs, Stranger in a Strange Land, Fear of Flying, Play It Again, Sam, Cold Case, Trick or Treat, and the newest category is Kick 'Em in the Junk. All right, you ready?
All right, go ahead.
All right, so what do we got for you? All right, John. All right, Bruce, you got, what do we got? We got Kick 'Em in the Junk. All right.
Nice.
All right, so you can travel to any point in time and space, and without any repercussions whatsoever, you can kick someone in the junk. Who would it be?
Wow. Geez, there's a lot of people. I don't know. Maybe Lee Harvey Oswald could use a little kick in the junk. How about that?
All right, fair enough.
I can't imagine anyone would argue that point with me. So,
okay, good enough.
I'd probably get shot, but whatever.
All right, fair enough. All right, Bruce. So now we're going to move to our advice column. You and I are both in the writing business. So, what's the best and worst writing advice someone ever gave you, or advice you overheard?
Probably probably the worst advice I ever got was that I wasn't any good at this.
Not really advice.
Right. And but it was the reason that I ended up becoming a police officer, and it definitely informs my writing now. So I think probably the best advice I got was from my mentor, Kate Flora, when I first started writing. And her problem with my writing early on was that I didn't delve deep enough into the vulnerability of my main character. I think I was really afraid to give John Byron the same fears and worries that I myself have sometimes, right, that we all have, because I was afraid you'd get too close a look at the guy who's writing the stories.
Yeah, wow.
And she gave me permission to make John vulnerable if I needed to, because as she pointed out, he's not Bruce Coffin, he's John Byron.
Right.
And for whatever reason, that sounds like such simplistic advice, but I was really struggling with that. And it was like a switch went off and the light came on when she said that. And suddenly John really became 3-dimensional for me.
Right. You can always say, hey, look, when you're writing your book, I noticed, is that really you? No, that's not
right.
Me. The character, right. That has nothing to do with me.
Only the good stuff.
Only the good stuff, right. All right. And last, okay, so now we're going to discuss if you have thick skin. So as writers, when we put out our work and ourselves, criticism of all kinds comes with it, the good, the bad, and everything in between. How do you feel about reviews? Do you take them to heart? Do you let them roll off you, or do some stick with you more than others?
I think we always, I mean, I think most of us lie and say we don't read the reviews, but I know when you first start off, you read all of them. You know, I think we all know deep inside that no two people are going to have the same tastes. And you know, you can't possibly write a book that everyone's going to love.
Right.
You know, I mean, a case in point, the Bible definitely has its detractors. So, and if you couldn't win with that, you know.
Right.
So I think we all know that. I think it's every once in a while, somebody will seem like they get a little too personal, a little too nasty about the review. Those definitely bother me. They stick with me. They probably shouldn't.
Right.
And my wife won't let me read any of those things until just before. She doesn't want me reading them just before bed because she knows I won't sleep that night, you know. But I think that's just true of anything. I mean, you and I could go see a movie or something, and I might love it and you won't. And sometimes you don't love it because the movie's no good, or maybe it's not your taste, or maybe it's just where you're at the time you see it.
Right.
Because I've done that. I've read a book and didn't really care for it. And then I've gone back and picked it up, forgetting that I'd read it 5 years later, and I loved it. So I think that says more about me than it does, more about the reader than it does the book itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Fair enough. All right. So that was great. So we have a few minutes. I'm going to take some questions from the audience, but I got one in here. This is from fellow author John French, who was a retired CSI, as I'm sure you know. So going back to your crime scene, so your accident investigations, he asked, what can you tell from airbags?
What can I tell from them?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the first, I mean, there's a lot of things you look at, but the first thing you are now, this was never a thing when I started, because airbags, when we were doing reconstruction, didn't exist at the beginning of that. Neither did anti-lock braking. So that's changed a lot. But most of your sensors that are responsible for the airbag going off in a vehicle require a certain amount of a minimum speed for them to actually function. So you know you're already dealing with a minimum amount of force to create that airbag, the situation where the airbag will actually fire, close the circuit and fire. So, but you know, there's a lot of different things that you can glean from that.
All right, fair enough. Okay, so we went through a lot. So we talked about your book. I'm going to share my screen one more time, and we're going to go back and share. All right. All right. So Within Plain Sight. So where can folks get it, and when is your next book due out?
So Within Plain Sight is available pretty much anywhere. And if you're somebody that likes to support the local bookstores, as I do, that's always my first choice. If I'm going to buy the physical book, do those people a service and get it from them. They can order from, you know, Baker Taylor and all those places, Ingram. So I would highly recommend that. But they're also available in hardcover large print form. And this particular book also all of them in ebook form. The different formats that are ebooks, so you can get them online, you can get them at the bookstores, and you can find them on HarperCollins webpage. They have a Robert Coffin webpage, and you can find all the books there with all the links to various things. So,
and when in book 5, when are we seeing that?
Book 5, I'm in the process of. It's been honestly very difficult to write during this lockdown, and the book writing has gone actually very well. It's the plotting that's been an issue for me. And I finally have developed a plot that I love. And so I am now, I'm working hard on the book. I'm not at the halfway mark I was with the last plot, but I'm getting there. So hopefully we'll have something done by the fall, and we'll see what we go from there.
All right. So we'll keep an eye on it. All right, Bruce, this was great. So since we've been talking about crime and mystery, if you're up for a little Blade Runner style sci-fi with your crime and mystery, I'll call attention to my own sci-fi noir, Crackle and Fire, featuring my hard-boiled intergalactic private eye, Angela Hardwick, who was
good
hired.
Stuff.
Great. I know you've been reading it, and
yes, yeah, good stuff.
Thank you. Who was hired to find a missing intern with stolen corporate files, but soon finds herself tackling with dueling gangsters, hostile protesters, and a madman from Earth with galactic ambitions of his own. Crackle and Fire is available on Amazon and published by Crazy 8 Press. And the follow-up to Crackle and Fire will be out in September. The title and the cover reveal will be coming soon. So That's our show. Thank you so much, Bruce, for, hold on, let me X out of here. I always have a tech thing here. Bruce, thanks so much for coming by the show and coming
Thank you.
back. This was
Happy
great.
anniversary.
Thank
This
you.
is awesome.
Yes, and I want to thank Bruce and everyone who's watching and helped celebrate my 1-year anniversary. Like I said, the show wouldn't have been on for as long as it's been if it wasn't for you guys, and I'm not slowing down. This was a great hour, and I'm going to see everyone next week. All right, take care. Thanks a lot, guys. Bye now.